Okay. Now go. Okay. May 29, 2022, praising Ascension, which is our understanding of Memorial Day. And you'll see by the end of this, you'll understand why it's Ascension and not just Memorial Day. I'm Reverend Walter Frank Jr., pastor of Family Church of San Diego. Our larger group is Family Federation for World Peace. World peace unification is important to us. We pray every day for world peace. And so let's just get started because we're already very late. Okay, we're going to begin with consummation of human history because the divine principle explains in clear terms what's the time we're living in and what's going on. So let's study. All creation was created to be the object of God's joy. However, man, as has been clarified in the principle of creation, was created to be the substantial object to God, returning joy to God through the action of our own free will. So we can decide return joy to God or make God be miserable. Therefore, man cannot become the object of God's joy unless we know what God's will is, right? If you don't understand why your baby's crying, you can't solve their crying, right? If the baby's cold, but you give him a bottle of milk, the kid's still going to cry. Kid's still suffering. You have to know, oh, he's cold. Or whatever the problem is, we have to know. So in order to bring joy to God, we have to know God's will, and then we understand how and what we have to do. And of course, and then we have to live according to God's will by our own effort. God can't make you be good. Consequently, man was created in such a way that he could know God's will and live by it forever, experiencing God's heart and zeal as his own. Does that make sense? So we're created to love God and know God, just like your feelings are to do good, right? So we say the world's constantly changing, and our world has changed most dramatically since 1517, or about 500 years ago, which began the Protestant Reformation of Christianity. But today we'll discuss a few important events through the eyes of divine principle, which we think may give us a clearer understanding of what's going on in our world today. So let's continue consummation of human history. God's second blessing was for Adam and Eve to attain the true parenthood by multiplying children of goodness, and then to establish homes, societies, and a world of good sovereignty. But due to the fall, Adam and Eve became evil parents, multiplying evil children, and thus formed a world under the bondage of evil sovereignty, which we all see all the time, right? Just look at Ukraine, North Korea, China, the wars. God has conducted the providence of restoring man's spiritual standard by separating men from Satan. How does God do that? On an internal basis through religion. So we think the central religion is Christianity, but Buddhists also are separating from evil. Confucianists also are separating from evil, right? While on the other hand, okay, part of it's religion, he has separated men from Satan on an external basis through various struggles and wars. Did you know that was in the Divine Principle book? Through various struggles and wars. Okay. Thus he has conducted his providence, restoring the sovereignty of goodness on both an internal and an external basis. For example, 1102, trade in slaves and serfdom condemned by the Church in London, Council of London, 1102. We say that Christianity began to exert its influence over the old Roman ideas, Egyptian ideas, Assyrian ideas of enslaving your neighbor. So, begins to change. So, 1117, slavery abolished in Iceland. You know why there's no African American slaves in Iceland? Because Christians said, no, we're not having them here. Papal encyclical 1435 of Pope Eugene IV banning enslavement on pain of excommunication. Because most of Southern Europe was Catholic, that's why there weren't black African slaves in Europe. Because the Pope said, no, you can't do it. Where were the slave colonies? In the Protestant Americas. 1783, on the other hand, even in Protestant Americas, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled slavery unconstitutional, a decision based on the Christian conscience and Massachusetts Constitution. All slaves are immediately freed in 1783. Isn't that amazing? Right, so we say this is an internal, leaving Satan internally through the knowledge of Christianity. 1783, New Hampshire begins a gradual abolition of slavery. 84, Connecticut begins a gradual abolition of slavery, freeing future children of slaves and later all slaves. 1784, Rhode Island begins a gradual abolition of slavery. So what's going on is by internal teaching, people are understanding, no, this is evil. We're seeing that slavery is evil, and we're gonna reverse that. We're gonna leave Satan voluntarily. For example, okay, here's another one. American Memorial Day for those lost during the American Civil War, what we call internal liberation due to religion, is this. Jesus said his word is like a mustard seed. It starts small, being the smallest of seeds, but soon grows to become a large tree, home for birds and animals and things like that. So, abolitionism was a movement to end the institution of slavery and the worldwide slave trade. So, when Christianity begins, the Roman Empire still has slaves, right? And they don't give up slaves for 1,000 years. It's not till the Christians actually exert power in Europe and begin to be able to understand the teachings of Jesus and voluntarily give up slavery. But if there was no Christianity, the Roman Empire would exist and there'd be slaves forever. The term abolitionist refers to those who were actively against slavery, which movement was mainly in the United States and Britain. Among Christians, the movement originated with the Quakers in Britain and the United States around 1750 and attracted mostly evangelicals. So Catholics in Southern Europe had said no to slavery, and now the Protestants in the United States and England are beginning to say also no to slavery. The result was that the international slave trade was made illegal around 1810 and enforced by the British Navy. All the northern states in the United States abolished slavery between 1777 and 1803, and the British Empire abolished it in the 1830s in its Caribbean colonies and Canada. Did you know that history? Everybody should know this history, because Christianity is what saved people and ended slavery. But if we don't know it, how are we going to teach it to anybody? So let's continue. Men lost their original value because of the fall. In the present age, meaning now, in the present age, however, the democratic ideology has reached its culmination, and men have come to pursue the original value of individuality endowed at creation. This may be seen in the liberation of slaves, liberation of minority groups, and liberation of minor powers, together with the demand for human dignity. Am I in your way? Equality between the sexes. Do you know that was in the Divine Principle book? Anyhow, equality among all people. This is proof that the last days have come and fallen men are now entering the new age in which they restore God's first blessings to men. So far this is based on knowing internal knowledge of God's will and then freely expressing God's will on the earth by laws and those sorts of things. So here's one of the abolitionists. You heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Was a white female author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel discussing the horrors of slavery that galvanized the abolitionist movement in America. A woman of deep Christian convictions, she felt these convictions led her to write her most famous novel. Her father was a minister, her brother a minister, her husband was a Christian minister. She lost her mother at an early age, and one of her children was an infant, losses that helped her emphasize with the hurt caused by slavery and the selling off of families. So she lived in Ohio, which by state constitution was free of slavery, but just across the border in Kentucky, there was slavery. If you've never been in Cincinnati, you know it's just right across the river. She could see slaves being mistreated, the selling off of families and children from their parents. Harriet Beecher Stowe believed herself to be an instrument of God when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book sold more than 300,000 copies in 1 year. Public apathy towards slavery quickly changed to a public compassion for the victims of slavery and public revulsion and outrage at the slavery system itself. In 1807 to 25 March, abolition of the slave trade abolishes slave trading in British Empire. Captains fined 120 pounds per slave transported. 1807, the British begin patrols of African coast to arrest slaving vessels. The West African Squadron of the Royal Navy is established to suppress slave trading. By 1865, nearly 150,000 people freed by anti-slavery operations. They would take them back to Africa. They would arrest the perpetrators, take them back to Africa. Reverend Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher. Henry Ward Beecher wanted to become a sailor, but after an intense religious conversion, decided on the ministry instead. His religious feelings were marked by an emotional tenderness and a deep sensitivity to the motherly heart of God. So, just like us, he believed in the motherly heart of God. The greatest religious orator of the 1850s, Beecher used words with the skill of an artist, creating a masterpiece. Adamant in his opposition to slavery, he challenged America to recapture the vision of one nation under God. So all these things are going on, right? And who did they elect as president? Abraham Lincoln, who rises as an anti-slave president. Horace Bushnell, in his 1846 book, Christian Nurture, wrote, America has been given a special purpose and mission by God in line with the direction which God had inspired the Puritan colonists to build a thoroughly Christian nation. He spoke about sharply from his pulpit. He saw slavery as a miserable hypocrisy to our first principles and condemned the slaughter of the Indians. If there is a just God in heaven, God could not be with us. Right? Who said those words? Reverend Moon. Quakers in slavery. Much like the good Christians that helped Jews escape Germany during World War II, Quakers and other Christians helped African Americans escape slavery. This was called the Underground Railroad. And they did this at the risk of their lives. Okay. This is from Consummation. It's about struggle, wars, and fighting, because we're going to get to actual war and Memorial Day. Therefore, struggles and fights between individuals of God's side are evil, because they result in the destruction of the good sovereignty itself. For example, the Old Testament age, Absalom trying to kill David, that's an evil action. Killing Jews, killing Christ, evil action, etc., etc. Protestants versus Catholics, that would be an evil action and an evil war. God will not support that, right? But for the good sovereignty to destroy the evil sovereignty, for example, justifiable homicides such as cops killing killers or hostage takers or torturers or serial murderers, we consider that an act of goodness because it is to fulfill the purpose of God's providence and restoration. That's why we think those soldiers who died in wars of emancipation, wars against tyranny, those people will ascend to heaven because they're doing an act of goodness. Therefore, struggles and fights between individuals of God's side are evil because they result in the destruction of good sovereignty itself. But for the good sovereignty to destroy the evil sovereignty is an act of goodness because it is to fulfill the purpose of God's providence of restoration. For example, destroying Adolf Hitler, Nazis, imperialist Japan, the Axis powers were actually considered an act of goodness. And most importantly, not just an act of patriotism, not just an act of self-defense. It's an act of goodness, and it furthers God's will and a step closer to building the kingdom of heaven on earth. We don't like killing or fighting or war. On the other hand, God must be involved in it because otherwise there'd be no hope for everybody. So, first Memorial Day was celebrated by who? African American families that had recently been freed and made citizens to honor the sacrifice of many northern white soldiers who had died in the war. Did you know that? But we'll get there in a second. First, extraordinary life story of Harriet Tubman, the female Moses who led hundreds of slaves to freedom as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Do you see this? She saved over 300 slaves from slavery. And there should be statues of her all over the country. Now this is going to get serious. This is her eyewitness testimony of slavery. At 13 years old, she said, she had heard the shrieks and cries of women who were flogged in the Negro quarter. She had listened and groaned out in prayer, "O Lord, have mercy." She had already seen two older sisters. If you read her biography, which of course I read her biography, she said how much she cried to see her younger sisters led in a chain gang away from their home. And she could never see them again. She said she climbed up a fence to see them a little further. Come back. Come back, I said. Thank you. As part of a chain gang, she had seen the agonized expression on their faces as they turned to take a last look at their old cabin home, then watched them from the top of the fence as they went off weeping and lamenting till they were hidden from her sight forever. And she was sad about that for her entire life. So, Genesis 6, here's what we say. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. That's who slavers are. They don't just break human hearts, they break God's heart. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and grieved God to his heart. So when Harriet Tubman feels these incredible feelings, she's feeling God's heart. So God must do something, right? So she escaped, by the way. I had crossed the line, was free, but there was no one to turn to. Come back. To welcome me to the land of the freedom. I was a stranger in the strange land. But she decided, since she had escaped once, she's going to help other people escape, right? She helped a slave named Job to escape. Job was described as strong and powerful and an intelligent and faithful person. However, being valuable, he was sold at a high price. His new master began by beating him to show him he must obey at all times the orders of the master, right? So he would just beat him senseless. So what happened is she has escaped, and now she comes back to save people. She actually saves him. She so shows him how to escape. He escaped to Canada the next day at the guidance of Harriet Tubman. So she would guide people how to get away, how to escape. According to Christianity Today, Tubman's friends and fellow abolitionists claimed that the source of her strength came from her faith in God as deliverer and protector of the weak. This is really significant because when we talk about ending slavery, it's not about patriotism or nationalism, or it's not even about civil rights. It's about divine rights that God intended for all human beings. She says, I always told God, she said, I'm going to hold steady on you, and you got to see me through. She saved over 300 slaves. Life as a free black woman, although Harriet was wanted at a price of $40,000, she was a master of disguise, and even a former owner did not recognize her. So she would go and pretend she's just an old, crazy old woman, right? And no one would care about her, but she had a revolver in her petticoat, but she would guide people, talk to them, meet with them at night, and then let them escape. She was nicknamed the Moses of her people from the Bible story of Moses leading the Israelites from slavery. Harriet became a spy for the Union Army when the Civil War began. Harriet later worked in Washington as a government nurse, and you know what? She knew Abraham Lincoln personally. She knew Seward was Secretary of State. She lived in this house with him. Tubman, according to one biography, was a Republican who worked also in the women's suffrage movement. She helped the Union Army during the Civil War, leading one raid and carrying a rifle. She passed away in 1913, so she lived a long life. God bless her. So, when we read Harriet Tubman's heroic testimony, she helped hundreds of slaves escape from the South and horrible slavery. The suffering of slavery was horrible. Do you think they prayed to God for a savior? Don't you think that's true? Who would God send as a savior? Who could he send? Yes and yes. Who does God send? He sends the American military. It's the American Union Army that saves all the slaves. So this is the Psalms. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. That's what's going on by the American military in the 1860s. Sorry, let's read this. This is the first Memorial Day. The first widely publicized observance of a Memorial Day type observance after the Civil War was in Charleston, South Carolina, May 1st, 1865. During the war, Union soldiers who were prisoners of war had been held at Charleston Racecourse. At least 257 Union prisoners died there and were hastily buried in unmarked graves. Together with teachers and missionaries, black residents of Charleston organized a May Day ceremony in 1865, which was covered by the New York Tribune and other national papers. The freedmen cleaned up and landscaped the burial ground, building an enclosure and an arch labeled Martyrs of the Racecourse. Okay, they call them martyrs, Christian martyrs. These are African American people who were freed slaves, called them martyrs of the racecourse. Nearly 10,000 people, mostly freedmen, gathered on May 1st to commemorate the war dead. Involved were about 3,000 school children, newly enrolled in freedmen's schools, mutual aid societies, Union troops, black ministers, and white northern missionaries. Most brought flowers to lay on the burial field. Today the site is used as Hampton Park. Years later, the celebration would become what's called the first Decoration Day in the North. David W. Blight described the day. This was the first Memorial Day. African Americans invented Memorial Day in Charleston, South Carolina. What you have there is black Americans recently freed from slavery announcing to the world with their flowers, their feet, and their songs what the war had been about. What they basically were creating was the Independence Day of a second American Revolution. Here's a picture, right? They still had cameras in there. So here's 10,000 African Americans, martyrs of the racecourse, dedicating graves to fallen American soldiers.
White or black?
Pardon me?
The fallen American soldiers are white or black?
Probably white. Probably white. I don't know the numbers. So here's what I teach and what the Divine Principle teaches. Like the soldiers of Nehemiah, American soldiers have been defending the human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was American soldiers that freed the slaves in the USA. We say there's an internal struggle. In the North, internal struggle won. But in the South, internal struggle couldn't work. So there's an external struggle, a struggle that actually caused a war, right? The American soldiers that freed the slaves in the USA. Casualties for the American Civil War, Union dead. 364,511 Union soldiers died to free the slaves. Union wounded, who didn't die, 281,881. Total Union loss, 646,392 Union soldiers died in this incredible battle called the Civil War. So, but what's the result? The 13th and 14th Amendments, that is an abolition of slavery nationwide and freeing of the slave. The 14th is giving slaves born in America the right to vote. Isn't that amazing? So we say these soldiers gave their lives not just for patriotism. They gave their lives for God's will of goodness to take place in the United States and eventually the whole world. That's why we're celebrating Memorial Day. That's why we celebrate the lives of soldiers and those who have passed away at this time. Number two, that's story number one. There's going to be, I think, 4 stories. This is story number 2. Okay. American soldiers had ended slavery in the USA by 1865, right? Ended slavery in all of the Americas. But 1939, Nazi Germany had recreated slavery where? In Europe. And not just Jews, but also Christians, Slavs, Poles, Russians, French. Did God hear the prayers of these people? Absolutely. And who did God send? Once again, without the United States soldiers, without America, it's not possible to have overturned Germany. The Russians were losing 3 or 4 to 1 against German soldiers. If there was not a Western Front led by America, England could not invade Europe. It's impossible without the United States of America. So without the United States of America, all of Germany would remain Nazis. And by the way, Hitler didn't plan to just kill all the Jews. He planned to kill all the Polish people, all the Czechs, all the Slavs, all the Russians. He planned to kill everybody. The 12 million killed in his concentration camps was just the beginning. Here's a story of liberation during World War II, just to show you how did people feel about the American soldier. For decades, the tale of the liberation train was forgotten chapter of World War II. U.S. Army's 30th Infantry Division returned for a reunion that brought the story back. It involved a train shuffling 2,500 Jews from one death camp to another as the Nazis tried to hide their crimes. Luckily for 5-year-old Dutch Jew John Franzman and the other riders of the liberation train, the U.S. Army showed up a few hours later. So Germans were transporting Jews from one camp. You can read about this in Eli Weissman's book, Night. He remembers his mother's body language changing when the soldiers came to you, because they didn't know who the soldiers were. They thought these more Nazis. But it was transmitted that this was good, that we were being rescued, since Franzman, now 64 of London, right? When they saw the Americans, what did they say? We're saved. We're saved from the Nazis. So this is the reunion. Most of the U.S. troops who were there for the train rescue near Magdeburg in northeastern Germany have died. But 7 of the train's riders, who in 1945 were teens and children assigned to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, have come in from all over the world, right? So they came from Israel, wherever they were, they came to revisit being saved by the American soldier. This is what Ariella Rojek said. They were our angels. This is what she thought about American soldiers. They were our angels, said Ariella Rojek, 75, a train rider who emigrated to Canada after the war. She remembers the strange looks on the faces of the war-hardened GIs who weren't used to seeing atrocities against civilians. They weren't prepared, she said, for what they looked like, what had been done to them. So this is just one small story, right? Where the Jewish people think, what do they call the Americans? They don't call them soldiers. They call them angels. These are our angels, our saviors. The Nazis did kill approximately 12 million people in their concentration camps. And you should understand that was only the beginning. Their goals were much larger. They wanted to kill all Jews, all Slavs, all Polish people, and they did kill more than 25 million Russians. That doesn't count the Poles they killed, the Czechs they killed, everybody else they killed all over the world. The point is, without the United States soldiers, their killing would have gone on indefinitely. Would they have killed 100 million people? Would they have killed every Jew in Europe? Yeah, they would. If they had done that, then there'd certainly be no nation called Israel, would there? Without the U.S. military, there would be no end to Nazism or racism. Russia would have fallen, China would have fallen. It would have been hell on earth, worse than the Roman Empire, and no one could have done anything about it. There would have been no nation called Israel, right? And I'm going to just show you this picture because I think it's interesting during our times. Top row, Jewish women in concentration camp. Bottom row is who? The granddaughters of the Holocaust survivors. Look at the difference. Bottom row, right? Granddaughters of the survivors. All armed up. All of them saying, no one's doing this to us again. No one will do this to us again. And they're prepared for it. Isn't that amazing? Why? And there would be no Israel. None of these women would exist without the American soldier. They would not be alive. So one more story for our Vietnam veterans who struggled because Vietnam was so controversial. The left won the propaganda war against American soldiers who went to Vietnam. But let me read you some of the stories, a couple of stories from Vietnamese refugees. This lady, I'm going to tell her story. Vietnamese refugee creates a monument for veterans in 2018. Nearly 3 years ago, Ty Cavanaro set off on a mission to find every Vietnam War veteran in Barnegat and thank him for his service. Without them, she says, she would not have survived. Cavanaro's family fled Saigon on April 30th, 1975, hours before the Communist forces captured the South Vietnamese capital and took refuge in the United States. She was a little over 1 year old at the time. Cavanaro, now 44, Barnegat gave thanks to hundreds of Vietnam veterans last Thursday, unveiling what may be the country's first Vietnam Veterans Monument created by a Vietnamese refugee. By the way, in business, I know lots of Vietnamese people, and they are grateful to the United States. You helped keep communists away from our neighborhoods in Vietnam, she told hundreds of veterans and supporters at Gazebo Park in Barnegat. And you made sure we had safe passage to your own country when we lost ours. Wearing a long yellow and red dress designed like the South Vietnamese flag, Cavagnaro lifted the white cover and revealed a 21 by 28-inch black plaque, which she and her husband James purchased in large white letters. The monument says, "Welcome home." Right? Welcome home, Vietnam veterans, in memory and honor of all those who served, died, or remained missing in the Vietnam era. Presented in gratitude by the Vietnamese community of New Jersey, Kam An Kok Ban, dedicated by Ty and James Cavagnaro. Is that interesting? Our Vietnam veterans should understand many Vietnamese refugees consider them saviors and appreciate them. This was from that day. Okay, here's another one. Vietnamese refugee tells story of rescue by Navy leading to military service, 2016. Panelists for the symposium included former Vietnamese refugee Lieutenant Colonel Lan Dalada and 2 veterans of the USS Ranger who rescued 138 Vietnamese refugees on a boat in March 1981. Lan Dalada was 13 years old and living in war-torn communist Vietnam when his parents decided to risk everything and flee the country in 1981. Facing a possible capture by the Vietnamese, or worse, death, Dalada's family boarded a wooden fishing boat with 137 other refugees seeking a new life. The boat, designed to carry just 25 people, drifted at sea for nearly 2 weeks. The group went days without food or water. Then, on the horizon, we saw a metal floating city, said Dalad. We couldn't believe it. The floating city turned out to be the USS Ranger CV-61 aircraft carrier. The crew rescued all 138 people aboard the tiny fishing vessel that was stranded hopelessly in the South China Sea. This is him. This is him, and this is his son and some of his brothers. So here's what he says. Once grown, Dalad joined the same military that rescued him and so many others in the South China Sea, and has since earned the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Army. His brother also serves in the military, and his son is hoping to soon be accepted into the United States Naval Academy. It is a family tradition now, Dalad told the crowd. We serve in the United States military. Isn't that interesting? What a great story. So for our Vietnam vets who felt nobody was grateful to the USA, there's many, many Vietnamese refugees who are grateful. This is the third story. Grateful South Koreans mark war anniversary. Here's what Koreans say, what these Koreans are saying. Without America, everything would belong to North Korea, says Byun, 54, who fondly recalls U.S. post-war food support and now earns $10,000 a month growing tomatoes. There would be no food, no life. We would be stuck in one country without communication with the outside world, he says. But in South Korea, we love freedom and democracy. That's why we developed so much, right? Think of North Korea. How many millions, the North Koreans killed the Christians of Pyongyang who are supposed to receive true parents. They tortured them to death, right? They killed them. Mother talks about her own mother and grandma being put in a communist prison camp for 2 weeks. They were let out, and finally then they escaped back to South. And who did they escape to? The American military. There's no one else to escape to. So grateful South Koreans mark war anniversary. From the bombed out ruins in the 1950s, South Korea has soared in recent decades to become today's high-tech, trend-setting world powerhouse. The world's 13th largest economy. This summer, South Korea marks the 65th anniversary of the July 27th, 1953 armistice that brought a ceasefire but no peace treaty, leaving the Koreas technically still at war today. Many South Koreans are quick to express gratitude for the United States' help in repelling the North Korean and Chinese forces. Unlike the United States, the war is far from forgotten here. However, there is widespread concern that younger generations fail to grasp how important the war is to their freedoms and the way of life, and how the enemy then remains on the border today in the form of North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, grandson of dictator Kim Il-sung. Right? Still danger. Between Mao, Pol Pot, Kim Il-sung, millions were killed and tortured to death. Without the U.S. military intervening in Southeast Asia, how many more millions would have been killed, tortured? There'd be no South Korea freedom, no Taiwanese freedom, no Japanese freedom. It all would have gone away. Where would we be without the American soldier? Now, this is just a brief story. South Korean President Moon Jae-in participates in a wreath-laying ceremony at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington on Friday. Okay? So this happened. He came to America. A new memorial for the Korean War was created, and he came to lay a wreath there. Right? I thought this was just an interesting story. So this is a picture of Korean refugees from where? Hungnam Harbor, right? South Korean President Moon Jae-in brought with him to the U.S. last week his mother's vivid memory of her rescue by the Americans in what is often called the Forgotten War on the Peninsula. Moon's mother, Kang Han-ok, was one of the 14,000 refugees fleeing the horrific battle at the Chosin Reservoir in what is now North Korea, who had crammed aboard the USS Meredith Victory, the ship of miracles. Right? So, they were rescued by the Americans from the communist north, all got about 14,000 people on one boat. And President Moon was the last president of Korea. His mother was on that boat, and she remembers. And here's something that she said that I really appreciate. According to my mother, who is now 90 years old, on the 24th of December 1950, halfway through the voyage, American soldiers handed out a candy droplet to each refugee on board as Christmas presents. 14,000 bits of candy, right? I believe this story has not yet been told, Moon said. Although it was but one droplet, I will always be grateful to the United States service members with such caring hearts for the giving Christmas presents to so many refugees in the middle of a devastating war. Moon said through a translator in a moving ceremony last Wednesday at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. Now, I just want to juxtapose what were communists doing to the refugees. Killing them, torturing them, murdering them, taking all their food, starving them. What were the American Marines doing and sailors doing? Giving them candy. That's the difference between American soldiers and other soldiers, giving them candy. So you can see, here's one of the guys, one of the refugees, happy. Here's some more ladies, probably you know them. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel, the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea to the south. This invasion was just the first military action of the Cold War. On September 15, 1950, United Nations American forces under Douglas MacArthur rescued the beleaguered South. 1 month after the capture of Seoul, UN forces reached the gates of Hungnam Prison. Who was in Hungnam Prison at the time? Reverend Moon. Knowing the UN forces were near the communist prison, authorities began to execute the prisoners. The prison camp was liberated by UN forces just hours before Reverend Moon's scheduled execution. This is Reverend Moon's talk about his time in Hungnam. The night before my scheduled execution, the bombs fell like rain in the monsoon season. It was October 13, 1950, and the U.S. forces, having succeeded in the Incheon landing, had come up the peninsula to take Pyongyang and were now pressing against Hungnam. The U.S. military attacked Hungnam with full force that night, with B-29 bombers in the lead. The bombing was so intense that it seemed all of Hungnam had been turned into a sea of fire. The high walls around the prison began to fall, and guards ran for their lives. Finally, the gate of the prison that had kept us in that place opened at around 2 o'clock in the morning. On the next day, I walked calmly out of Hungnam prison with dignity. Now, this was just released. This was just released recently. This was the B-29 bombers bombing Hungnam, right? The Hungnam chemical complex, which remained undamaged throughout World War II, was demolished by B-29 bombers with the Far East Air Force. Isn't that interesting? So Father's testimony backed up by the CIA. Hungnam was an extermination camp where prisoners were deliberately worked to death. Few lasted more than 6 months, yet in that horrific concentration camp, Reverend Moon survived for nearly 3 years. Although he did not speak a word of the divine principle, many of his fellow prisoners looked to him for spiritual strength and became his disciples. No one has been more grateful to the United States Armed Forces than Reverend Mrs. Moon. In Mother's autobiography, she escaped North Korea to where? To the safety of the Americans. Now, I don't know that that's a picture of true mother. It's a Korean little girl, and here's American soldiers. And what are they doing? Giving her candy. Isn't that amazing? What a story. So this is the memorial. This is a Korean memorial. And this is Korea in honor of those men and women from Columbia County who served in the memory of those who died defending a country they never knew and a people they never met. So this is one of the memorials. And this is Korea, the Forgotten War from this particular place. People who had passed away. Engraved on granite blocks are the dead. Near the water pool at the east end of the mine are the dead. United States, 54,246 American soldiers died to save South Korea. 103,284 were wounded. 7,140 were captured and missing. Still missing, 8,177. So we can think they're just American soldiers. They're just soldiers. Maybe they were drafted, whatever. But they were doing God's will. Because without them, the whole of Asia would have fallen to the communists.
And 16 other nations.
And I think it's 15 other nations.
Or 15.
America makes the 16th. But 90% of it was the United States of America, believe me. Now this is something interesting. On all the grave sites of American soldiers, what do they put as the marker? The Christian cross, right? Are we a Christian nation? Yeah, absolutely. That's why all our dead have crosses. A few of them have Stars of David, have crosses on their graves. Because this is a sign that Christians died here to save others, right? Remember in 2012, True Father sent the Little Angels Korean folk dance group all around the world to thank the U.S. Armed Forces for their part in saving himself, so Korea and the world from communist tyranny, right? Remember, Father sent these people all over, Colonel Pak, and they went all over. You can see these were people, these actually veterans around the world that Father said, please thank all these guys, right? I think these are Canadians, not certain. Anyhow, wherever they're from, Father said, please thank them. And actually, I'm going to show you something very special. Father also came here to San Diego. And when he came to San Diego, Father told Colonel Pak to say a special prayer for those who died. And this is San Diego. Here's John Kenny. Here's our brothers and sisters. Here's Pastor Frank, Colonel Pak, Mrs. Pak, Reverend Jong, Sidell, Robert Enier, all our brothers and sisters, right? Andy's in here somewhere, I think. Anyhow. Okay, listen to this prayer. So at that time, I was working for Nick Popovich, who was a veteran of Iraq, and he was running for the representative. So I invited him and his whole crew, all his Marine buddies, he was a Marine, to come to hear this. And they came to hear this. And at the end of the program with the Little Angels, Father told Colonel Pak, you say an ascension prayer. You say an ascension prayer for everybody who died in Korea. So here's what happened. This is from Alvarado A. Provencio, who came to visit us, and I asked them, please send me some testimonies. Gunnery Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Here's what he says. As a Marine and family member of 12 Marines, including 3 Korean combat veterans, one being my father, I was honored to see the appreciation bestowed to the United States of America from the Republic of Korea. I recall the time I spent in Pohang, 1989 to 1990, with fond memory of the Korean people. It was wonderful to see the little angels representing their country, sharing their culture with us as an appreciation. Listen to this, he says. I was touched when the announcer, Colonel Park, ordered the Korean War vets that had passed away to come see this special event. So all you guys in spirit world, you come and watch this. My wife whispered to me that my father was watching from heaven. I am very grateful that after 60 years, our true allies and friends of the Republic of Korea did not forget the sacrifice for their nation. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, actually, I was part of all of that.
Uh-huh.
And organizing it, and actually I was in the presence of Father when Father told Dr. Park to make that kind of prayer.
Right.
And Dr. Park was so worried what was going to happen to the kind of reaction were they going to have
Yeah.
to him saying that. So it's really nice to see.
Isn't that nice to see? So that was one of our San Diego guys. Okay. This is the important part. This is the end. John 15:13. No greater love has no man than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends, right? Our Memorial Day, we don't think they're just soldiers. We think they're saints. We think they're holy saints. No group in human history has done more saving of human life than the U.S. military. And again, you can count millions, hundreds of millions of people saved because of the American military. Do you remember the ascension ceremony for the Korean soldiers in 2010? There was a Navy boat and the North Koreans bombed it and killed 48 Korean soldiers. What did Father do? So you say, well, they're lost somewhere in the spirit world. No. Father did an ascension ceremony for these 48 sailors who had died. And he did others for General Haig and others, right? Surely, Jesus and true parents are raising a spiritual army in the spirit world from the men who gave their lives for others. Don't you think that's true? I think that's 100% true. John 5:24. Very truly I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged by what has crossed over from death to life. Very truly I tell you, a time is coming, and has now come, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to judge, because he is the Son of Man. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. And those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. I think absolutely true parents, he's talking about true parents coming now to resurrect, to do the Seonghwa ceremony for all those who have died in the past, giving their life for the salvation of others. Don't you think that's amazing? I think that's amazing. Amen? Amen. Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it very much.